Marco Polo entered the world in 1254 in Venice, a city that seemed to float between sea and sky. Marble palaces rising from green water, merchants shouting along canals, and sails from every corner of the world brushing past stone docks. Venice was not merely a city. It was a gateway where Europe touched the East through trade, diplomacy, and rumor. Spices from Alexandria, silk from Cathay, gold from Africa, everything passed through Venetian hands. Marco grew up hearing not children's tales, but stories of caravans crossing deserts, of emperors in distant lands, of markets filled with wonders no map yet captured. The lagoon shaped his imagination long before the road shaped his journey. His family belonged to this merchant aristocracy. The Polo house traded in precious goods, silks, gems, metals, moving wealth across seas and land routes that connected the Mediterranean to Asia. Marco's father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle Maffeo were seasoned travelers long before Marco learned to walk. They sailed to Constantinople, they traded along the Black Sea, and they vanished into the caravan routes of the East, leaving Venice behind for years at a time. Their absence set the rhythm of Marco's early life, a childhood marked by waiting, hearing whispers of their exploits, learning that distance was not barrier but opportunity. The young Marco was raised in this atmosphere of departure. With his mother's death early in his life, he spent his formative years under the care of extended relatives who ensured he received an education suitable for a Venetian merchant, mathematics for trade, Latin for diplomacy, and the essentials of commerce. Markets became his classroom, where he watched traders weigh pepper like gold and listened to foreign languages weave through the air like threads of unknown worlds. By the time he reached adolescence, Marco understood that commerce was not simply buying and selling, it was negotiation, courage, risk, and curiosity. Venice, with its perfume of salt and ambition, prepared him better than any formal school could. From its ports, he heard news of Mongol expansion, of new routes carved across Asia under a single emperor whose territory stretched farther than imagination. While most children dreamed of armor or nobility, Marco grew up dreaming of horizons, of lands where the roads never ended. The Polo family was shaped by the sea, driven by trade, and destined to chase distances others only described. Marco Polo's birth in Venice was not the beginning of his story. It was the ignition of a path that would carry him farther than any European merchant had traveled before, into the heart of Asia and into the pages of history. Marco Polo's earliest years unfolded in the shadow of absence. While he was still a small child, his father Niccolo Polo and uncle Maffeo had already set out towards the east, first to Constantinople, then deeper still into Asia, where news traveled slowly and unpredictably. Marco grew up without the guiding voice of his father, relying instead on stories repeated by relatives who remembered Niccolo as a man of daring roots and sharp judgment. Even as a boy, Marco understood that distance defined his family, that the men who bore the Polo name were shaped as much by departure as by return. Venice, for him, was both cradle and waiting room, a city that taught him patience while his future stretched across a world he had yet to see. His education began not in a single classroom, but throughout the living structure of Venice itself. Tutors taught him reading, writing, and Latin, the language of administration and diplomacy, while mathematicians taught him the calculations necessary for trade. Young Marco learned to keep accounts, measure weights, assess currencies, and read contracts, preparing him for a life in commerce long before he ever saw a caravan. But his real learning took place in the markets that surrounded him. He listened as merchants bargained in Greek, Arabic, and Persian, and in those voices he heard the pulse of civilizations beyond maps. For Marco, education was not something confined to quiet rooms. It breathed in the crowd, echoed under vaulted trading halls, and traveled across the water with every arriving ship. Growing without his father made Marco unusually observant. He watched men negotiate with gestures when language failed, and learned that caution was as valuable as courage. Relatives ensured he understood the economics of Venice, how grain could stabilize a city, how salt could preserve more than food, how spices could shift the balance of power. History, geography, and trade routes were woven into his lessons like threads in a tapestry. He studied law and account-keeping with the same seriousness that knights devoted to sword practice. His destiny was trade, but trade demanded intellect as much as venture. Venice ensured he possessed both. Yet beneath this disciplined upbringing lived curiosity. Restless, wide-eyed, hungry, Marco spent evenings leaning over docks, staring at the horizon where sails vanished like secrets. Ships brought news of Mongols ruling from China to the Black Sea, of roads stretching beyond comprehension, of cities whose palaces glittered like stars. He dreamed not only of selling goods, but of seeing the worlds that produced them. His father's absence became not loss, but spark. While Niccolo Polo crossed Asia unaware that his son waited in Venice, Marco was quietly preparing. He was learning the languages, numbers, and instincts required for a journey he did not yet know he would take. When the day finally came that father and son stood beside each other, Marco was no longer merely a boy. He was ready for the world his father had left behind. When Marco Polo was around 15 years old, the world he had only heard in stories suddenly opened before him. His father, Niccolo, and Uncle Maffeo returned to Venice after years of travel across Asia, bringing with them news of the Mongol Empire and an invitation from the great Khan himself. They had sat in the courts of distant rulers, crossed lands few Europeans could imagine, and returned with a request that Venice send learned men to teach Christianity and share Western knowledge. Marco, who had grown up surrounded by maps, merchants, and tales of the Silk routes, now found himself standing before the men who had lived the legends of his childhood. Their return was not an ending. It was a summons. Within months, Marco joined them on a journey that would carry him beyond the horizon. Their expedition began in 1271, leaving the comfort of Venetian canals for seas churned by wind and uncertainty. From Venice, they sailed across the Mediterranean, passing through Acre, one of the last Crusader strongholds, where they secured permissions and letters from church authorities. Beyond Acre, the familiarity of Europe dissolved. The trio moved eastward through Armenia and Anatolia, entering lands shaped by Mongol rule, and stepped grasslands where caravans stretched like serpents beneath the sun. For Marco, each mile erased old boundaries. He watched cities change architecture like languages, saw deserts where the wind carved mountains from sand, and met people whose beliefs, food, and dress had no equal in Venice. This was not merely travel. It was transformation. Across Persia, Marco encountered the brutal beauty of empire at scale. They trekked through cities rebuilt after Mongol conquest, where stone and silk coexisted with scars of war. In desert towns, Marco learned that water was more precious than silver. At caravanserais, stone inns built for traders, He listened to merchants speak of Cathay as a place of unbelievable wealth. Illness struck travelers along the road. Sandstorms swallowed paths, and heat rose like fire from the ground. Yet Marco endured, strengthened by youth, curiosity, and the presence of two men who navigated these roads like seasoned captains. Each hardship built discipline. Each landscape widened his understanding of the world. Years passed before they reached the threshold of Kublai Khan's dominion. They crossed the Pamir Mountains, where air thinned and snow glowed blue beneath moonlight. Legend said that spirits haunted the passes, but Marco saw only endless possibility. When they descended from high plateaus into the steppes of Mongolia, the landscape changed again. Wider, flatter, alive with horsemen who rode like wind. The Silk Road stretched ahead, shimmering like a thread connecting worlds. Marco Polo had left Venice a boy raised among merchants, but on this first journey he grew into a traveler shaped by hardship and wonder. He followed his father and uncle into the heart of Asia, unaware that this path would one day make him one of history's most famous chroniclers, an eyewitness to the East at the height of its empire. The Silk Road did not welcome travelers with ease. Its length was a test of endurance, and every horizon promised both opportunity and risk. As Marco Polo journeyed deeper into Asia with his father and uncle, he stepped into a vast network of trade routes that stretched like arteries across deserts, mountains, and ancient kingdoms. Caravans moved slowly across shifting sands, their bells echoing under open sky. Days were blistering with sun, nights fell bitterly cold, and wind whispered through tents like an unseen guardian of the road. Marco observed firsthand how goods traveled farther than armies. Silks from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic, gold from Africa, passed hand to hand across kingdoms that rarely saw each other's faces. The road was more than a route. It was the world's longest conversation. Through Persia and the Oxus region, they faced landscapes that challenged the limits of human will. The desert stretched without mercy, where mirages shimmered like lakes and dunes swallowed footprints within moments. Caravans rested at oases where palm groves promised shade, and the sound of water felt like salvation. At night, travelers gathered around fires lit beneath foreign constellations, sharing stories in Arabic, Persian, Mongolian, and Greek. Marco, attentive and eager, absorbed every tale of kingdoms beyond mountains, of emperors whose palaces gleamed with gold, of beasts so strange that even the oldest traders had no word to name them. Language barriers dissolved through gesture and trade. In these encounters, Marco learned the diplomacy of survival, patience, observation, and the quiet art of listening. Crossing the Pamir Mountains became the most punishing chapter of his eastward passage. Peaks loomed like jagged walls, and the altitude thinned the breath of both men and animals. Snow-blind days and wolves haunted nights, and the wind carried a cold that stung like steel. Yet the landscape also humbled with beauty, glacier rivers cutting through stone, icicles glimmering like crystal spears, the moon painting the range silver each twilight. Travel became a rhythm of hardship and awe. Marco recorded how horses staggered from lack of grass, how travelers burned dried yak dung for warmth, how silence in the mountains felt ancient, as though the earth itself was asleep beneath ice. The Silk Road demanded endurance, not through swords, but through survival. As they descended from the high passes into the vast steppes of Central Asia, the world opened again into movement and life. Herds of horses thundered across grasslands, yurts dotted the horizon like white shells, and Mongol riders appeared and vanished with startling speed. Marco witnessed an empire knit together by roads instead of walls. Messengers traveled farther in weeks than armies had marched in years. Markets bustled with traders from every direction, exchanging goods without ever tracing their origins. For the young Venetian, the Silk Road was a revelation, a living artery of the world, where cultures blended like colors in a woven rug. By crossing it, Marco Polo did more than travel. He passed through the spine of Asia itself, gaining the knowledge, perspective, and wonder that he would later bring back to Europe as a window into the East. After years spent crossing deserts, mountains, and kingdoms linked only by dust and rumor, Marco Polo and his family finally reached the gates of Kublai Khan's empire. What stood before them was unlike any court known in Europe. Vast, orderly, and filled with a diversity of people, languages, and customs, reflecting a dominion larger than any king in the West could imagine. Riders in silk vests carried messages across courtyards lined with marble and jade. Elephants, adorned in embroidered cloth, walked beside soldiers in lamellar armor. The air itself seemed to shimmer with wealth and authority. Marco had arrived at the political and cultural heart of the Mongol world, a throne from which a single ruler governed lands stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea. The capital was not merely a city, it was a world in itself. When Marco and his relatives were brought before Kublai Khan, the moment carried weight beyond ceremony. The great Khan, seated beneath banners of imperial gold, examined the three Venetians with interest. They represented a faraway land few Mongols had ever seen, and they arrived bearing gifts, knowledge, and the promise of exchange between East and West. Marco, still young, stood quietly yet observantly, absorbing the grandeur of banners flickering in lamplight and courtiers dressed in brocade. Kublai's court was a place where decisions shaped continents, where religion, commerce, and power blended into policy. To stand within it was to witness history from the inside. The great Khan questioned them about Europe, its rulers, its faith, its wars, its roads. Marco listened to his father and uncle speak, but he also added details with clarity and curiosity that surprised the court. His youth seemed less a weakness and more a window into possibilities. In him, Kublai saw not merely a guest, but a tool, someone who could learn languages, observe customs, and serve the empire beyond the limits of an ordinary merchant. The Mongol rulers valued loyalty, intelligence, and adaptability above birthright. Marco possessed all three, and his attentiveness caught the emperor's eye. The boy from Venice who once gazed at ships in the lagoon now stood at the side of the world's most powerful sovereign. After this first audience, Marco Polo was granted permission to remain in the court, a privilege rarely offered to foreigners. He walked halls decorated with lacquer and gold, heard musicians from Central Asia and Persia playing side by side, and watched ambassadors bring tribute from kingdoms he had never known existed. Silk banners swayed like waves, incense drifted through pavilions, and scholars debated philosophy in languages Marco had yet to learn. The court was not merely a palace. It was the empire in miniature, a living map of Kublai Khan's reach. In those early days, Marco sensed that his life had entered a new chapter. He had reached the center of the world as he knew it, and in the great Khan's court, he would soon become not just an observer, but a participant in the history he once heard only as stories carried by the wind. Marco Polo's years in Kublai Khan's service transformed him from a foreign visitor into a trusted imperial agent. The great Khan quickly recognized that Marco possessed a rare combination: youthful energy, a sharp observational mind, and an ability to adapt to foreign cultures without hesitation. In a court where information was the currency of power, these traits made him invaluable. Thus, instead of being confined within palace walls, Marco was sent outward, into the vastness of the empire, bearing messages, gifts, and imperial authority. As an envoy, he did not merely travel, he represented the Khan himself. Every mission placed him at the intersection of cultures, religions, and languages, demanding negotiation, diplomacy, and courage. His assignments carried him across territories that rivaled the size of continents, through China's emerald river valleys, across the baking sands of the Gobi Desert, and into the mountainous frontiers where rebellions flickered like wildfire. In each region, Marco encountered people whose customs differed in astonishing ways: Muslim merchants of Central Asia, Buddhist monks in golden-roofed temples, Confucian scholars who debated astronomy and statecraft, tribal chiefs who swore loyalty with feasts and arrows. Marco observed how the Mongol Empire governed diversity not by erasing it, but by weaving it into a single political framework built on tribute, communication, and swift justice. His reports to Kublai Khan became windows into lands the emperor could not personally visit, shaping decisions that affected millions. Marco's role required more than travel. It demanded trust. As an envoy, he often carried imperial seals or verbal decrees that held the weight of law. He was permitted to use the Mongol yam, a relay system of horses and stations that allowed him to cross immense distances faster than traders or soldiers alone. At each post, he could switch mounts, receive shelter, and continue onward without delay. This network allowed him to witness firsthand the infrastructure that made the Mongol Empire function. Roads stretching like veins across Asia, guarded by patrols loyal to the Khan. Through Marco's missions, we glimpse how the empire sustained itself, not only by armies, but by communication, speed, and control of information. Some journeys lasted months, even years, taking him as far as Yunnan, Tibet, and coastal provinces alive, with silk production and maritime trade. In his accounts, he described cities with stone bridges so long they seemed endless, markets overflowing with porcelain and spices, and bureaucratic systems more complex than anything in Europe. He saw paper money circulate like blood through the economy, salt taxed with precision, and grain stored in massive granaries against famine. Marco sent all these details back to Kublai Khan, not as a storyteller, but as a diplomat gathering intelligence. His service marked the moment when a Venetian teenager became an instrument of global administration, carrying empire on his shoulders as lightly as a messenger carries scrolls. Through his work as an envoy, he became not merely a witness to world history, but one of the hands that helped write it. Marco Polo's assignments as envoy expanded into journeys across regions so vast and varied that they could have belonged to different worlds. In China's fertile east, he traveled through cities whose canals mirrored the architecture of Venice, but dwarfed it in size and sophistication. Boats glided like shadows across waterways lined with warehouses, temples, and silk-laden docks. Market squares rang with the voices of traders from distant provinces, each speaking a dialect Marco struggled to learn, yet eagerly recorded. Here, he saw rice paddies fed by ingenious irrigation, fields where mulberry leaves fed armies of silkworms, and artisans whose craft transformed thread into shimmering cloth. China was not legend. It was a meticulously engineered society, thriving under order and abundance. From the plains he moved into mountainous provinces, where the land challenged even the most seasoned traveler. Narrow passes cut through cliffs blackened by storms, and suspension bridges hung like spiderwebs over rivers that churned white with foam. In Buddhist monasteries built against sheer rock, Marco met monks who turned prayer wheels day and night, their chants rising like wind through hollow stone. There, he observed religious rituals foreign to Europe, incense spiraling into cold air, robes dyed saffron, statues of bodhisattvas adorned with candlelight. The spiritual landscapes of Tibet and Western China showed him worlds where faith governed daily life as strictly as law. Deeper into Inner Asia, the terrain flattened into endless steppes, where the horizon curved like the edge of the world. Nomadic tribes moved with the rhythm of the seasons, their yurts packed and rebuilt as naturally as breathing. Marco rode beside horsemen who could loose arrows at full gallop and never miss their mark, warriors whose ancestors had followed Genghis Khan across continents. Their hospitality was rugged but real. Meals of fermented mare's milk and roasted meat, fires that crackled beneath a sky bright with unfamiliar constellations. These journeys taught Marco that power in Asia was not measured only by cities, but also by riders who commanded landscapes as vast as oceans. His travels eventually led him to the fringes of Southeast Asia and coastal provinces, where goods from India, Arabia, and Africa converged in bustling harbors. Marco noted how porcelain was fired so thin it rang like metal, how spices perfumed the air, how paper money passed easily through the hands of farmers and nobles alike. Everywhere he traveled, he observed systems of irrigation, taxation, communication that held the Mongol Empire together like a massive woven net. By the time he returned to the court from his missions, Marco Polo had crossed more of Asia than any European of his age. His journeys revealed the continent not as a distant mystery, but as a dynamic, interconnected world. Through them, he became a vessel of knowledge, carrying the East back toward the West, long before the West could imagine its scale. Marco Polo's travels placed him before cultures so intricate and expansive that even his Venetian upbringing could not prepare him for their scale. In the cities of northern China, he marveled at administrative systems where officials were selected through examinations rather than noble birth, an idea revolutionary compared to medieval Europe. He witnessed festivals filled with lanterns that turned night into swirling bands of color, dances where silk moved like water, and theatrical performances that blended music, acrobatics, and poetry. The streets themselves pulsed with life. Scholars reciting philosophy, peasants selling rice cakes, astrologers predicting monsoon winds with charts and stars. Marco observed not just spectacle, but structure. China was a civilization of order rather than chaos, where even celebration had rhythm. Trade lay at the heart of this world, flowing with precision from province to province, like blood through a living body. Marco recorded how marketplaces stretched for hundreds of stalls, each devoted to spices, pearls, precious metals, lacquerware, and fine ceramics. Bargaining echoed like song across wooden floors. Silk caravans moved westward across deserts, while ships sailed eastward toward Korea and Japan. Taxes on salt alone funded armies, canals, and imperial palaces. He saw granaries built to prevent famine, warehouses so vast they seemed to contain the wealth of empires. Unlike Europe, where scarcity shaped daily life, the regions Marco visited were defined by abundance, produced through intelligent management rather than accident or luck. What astonished Marco most was technology. He described coal, black stones that burn like wood, fueling furnaces across northern China, a resource unheard of in Venice. He witnessed the use of paper money, lightweight and durable, circulating with trust enforced by imperial decree. In workshops, craftsmen carved ivory, cast bronze, and produced porcelain so translucent it seemed born from moonlight. Bridges arched across rivers in spans wider than anything Marco had known, constructed with engineering precision that European builders would not match for centuries. In coastal shipyards, he saw vessels with multiple masts and waterproof compartments, ships capable of traveling farther and carrying more than any European design of the time. Technology was not rumor. It shaped life visibly and continuously. Marco also observed social structures and habits that revealed how deeply culture influenced power. He saw public hospitals where the poor received treatment, postal stations that carried messages across the empire at astonishing speed, and city guards who patrolled night markets to ensure safety. The Mongol Empire governed with a combination of tolerance and discipline, allowing multiple religions to coexist while demanding loyalty above all else. In his writings, Marco portrayed Asia not as a land of fantasy, but as a sophisticated world operating on systems Europe had yet to imagine. His observations were a bridge, connecting continents, challenging assumptions, and showing that civilization existed not only in the West, but in innumerable forms across the East. Through his eyes, Europe glimpsed a planet richer, larger, and more interconnected than it had ever known. Marco Polo's service as an envoy eventually extended beyond the inner provinces of China, carrying him southward into the lush, humid kingdoms of Southeast Asia. He traveled by river, sea, and caravan through regions where palm forests met monsoon winds, and where trade ports glimmered with spices and jewels. In the kingdom of Champa, modern-day Vietnam, he observed rulers who prized war elephants more highly than cavalry, and saw marketplaces filled with cloves, nutmeg, camphor, and sandalwood. Coastal cities were shaped by tides as much as by kings, and ships from India, Java, and Arabia anchored side by side. Marco noted that the people sailed with astonishing skill, navigating by stars invisible from Venetian skies. Southeast Asia revealed to him a world where commerce moved at the speed of wind and current, and where kingdoms thrived not by land conquest, but by maritime mastery. From these tropical shores, Marco journeyed westward along trade routes that threaded the Bay of Bengal like woven silk, eventually reaching the coasts of India. There, he encountered cultures older than any he had seen, where temples stood like stone mountains and priests performed rituals in languages centuries older than Latin. In Gujarat and the Coromandel coast, Marco watched pepper farms blacken the air with scent and saw cotton textiles spun with precision fine enough to pass through rings. Markets overflowed with pearls fished from warm waters, diamonds mined from riverbeds, and indigo dyes richer than royal banners. India, he wrote, was a kingdom where wealth rose naturally from soil and sea. The abundance astonished him. Europe had known spices as rare treasure. Here they grew like common grain. On land, Marco crossed through Persia, where the ruins of ancient empires lay half swallowed by sand. He saw the aftermath of Mongol conquest, cities rebuilt beside broken walls, and palaces restored from ashes with marble and turquoise. In Tabriz, he walked markets famous across continents, where merchants traded carpets as soft as wind, saffron priced higher than gold, and glasswork bright as dawn. Persian scholars debated astronomy beneath mosque domes glazed sky blue. Zoroastrian, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities lived side by side, each woven into the economy of caravans and sea routes. Persia taught Marco that even destruction could not dim a society rooted deeply in learning and trade. As he continued through coastal regions of the Arabian Sea, Marco witnessed ports where pilgrims sailed toward Mecca, traders bargained with African gold brokers, and navigators carried monsoon knowledge as carefully as kings carried crowns. In Hormuz, he saw ships built without iron nails, sealed with coconut fibers and pitch, capable of traveling to Zanzibar and beyond. These observations shaped his understanding of the world's trade arteries, how goods and ideas moved not through a single empire, but through the collective pulse of many. His journeys into Southeast Asia, Persia, and India expanded his worldview beyond anything a European could imagine at the time. Through these lands, he saw civilizations linked by ocean routes and caravan paths, each rich with culture, industry, and innovation. When Marco Polo eventually returned west, he carried not only stories of distant kingdoms, but a map of connection, one that would challenge Europe's perception of the Earth for generations. After nearly 2 decades in the service of the Mongol Empire, the Polo family began preparing for a journey home. Long delayed, uncertain, and infinitely more perilous than the route that first carried them eastward. They had grown older in Asia. Marco entered the court a teenager, and now stood as a seasoned man shaped by deserts, mountains, and the politics of an empire. Their departure was granted only after they agreed to escort a Mongol princess to Persia. Her marriage meant to secure alliances in the western provinces. The journey was not a simple reversal of the path they once took. It required navigating seas ruled by monsoons and territories fractured by war. What had taken years of gradual travel eastward would now become a single precarious voyage west. The return began by sea, with ships heavy not only with goods but with knowledge. They sailed along coasts alive with trade winds and storms that tested even the most experienced navigators. The ocean was no gentle passage. Many vessels in their fleet were claimed by waves, disease, and disputed harbors. The Polos survived through resilience, diplomacy, and luck, a reminder that distance always demanded a price. They touched the shores of India once more, but this time their role was reversed. No longer envoys of the great Khan, they were travelers drifting steadily toward the memory of home. Ports that once dazzled them with novelty now appeared familiar, as though Marco carried pieces of the East within him, like echoes that would never fade. Crossing Persia again, Marco retraced old caravan routes now changed by time. Some cities had prospered, others lay broken by conflict or drought. The trio moved cautiously, aware that their years abroad had separated them from European politics and alliances. They traveled through lands where Mongol power was no longer unchallenged, where local rulers viewed foreigners with suspicion, and where safety depended as much on gifts as it did on steel. Yet every step westward felt closer to Venice, the city Marco had left as a boy. The road back was both homecoming and farewell. They were leaving behind the empire that had shaped their lives, yet carrying it in every memory, every detail Marco would one day write. In 1295, the Polos finally entered Venice again, ragged from the road, dressed in travel-worn garments unrecognizable to their own kin. Their return was marked less by triumph than disbelief. Neighbors assumed them dead, their wealth forgotten, their story buried beneath the tides of time. Only when they opened their garments and released silk, jewels, and gold hidden in hems and seams did Venice understand who had come back to its shores. Marco Polo's return was the return of worlds, of China, Persia, Java, India, carried not in sketches or maps, but in lived experience. He returned not as a merchant boy, but as a man who had walked farther than nearly any European of his time. His voyage home was the closing of a circle, yet the beginning of a legacy that would soon carry his name into history books, courts, and imaginations across the world. Marco Polo's return to Venice did not bring a final chapter of peace, but rather thrust him into a world where old rivalries burned hotter than any desert sun. Only a few years after coming home, Venice entered open conflict with Genoa. Two maritime republics locked in a struggle for dominance over Mediterranean trade. War was not a distant abstraction for Marco. Venetian merchants were expected to serve their city not only with wealth, but with ships and steel. So he joined the fleet, not as a traveler this time, but as a citizen defending the very port that had once sent him across the world. His years in Asia had sharpened his judgment, but battle showed him a different kind of unpredictability, one shaped by cannon fire and wind rather than diplomacy and caravan routes. In 1298, the Venetian fleet met the Genoese near Curzola, an island in the Adriatic, where blue water turned red under the clash of oars and arrows. The battle raged with ferocity, ships grappling like war beasts, boarding ramps slamming across decks, men fighting hand to hand in smoke thick as fog on the Silk Road. Venice fought with pride, Genoa with equal determination, and when the struggle ended, the sea was littered with shattered hulls and drifting sails. Marco's vessel was among those captured, and the man who had crossed Asia freely now found himself confined by his own continent. Chains replaced reins, and the envoy of emperors became a prisoner of merchants. Fate, it seemed, could bind as quickly as it had once set him free. Yet captivity did not silence him. It ignited a transformation. In Genoa, Marco was held not as an unknown wanderer, but as a Venetian whose name carried rumor and wonder. His fellow prisoners and even his captors soon discovered that this man had stories no map could contain. He spoke of cities larger than any in Europe, of paper money that replaced gold, of emperors who ruled lands beyond imagination. Word spread through prison corridors like fire through dry timber. In a cell shared with the writer Rustichello da Pisa, Marco began recounting his experiences with clarity shaped by memory and the sharpness of survival. What began as conversation between inmates became dictation, chapter by chapter, journey by journey. Thus, imprisonment became the birthplace of one of history's most influential travel accounts. While Genoa held his body behind stone walls, his mind roamed deserts and palace courts with unhindered freedom. He described the Silk Road not as myth, but as geography, China not as legend, but as civilization. The book that emerged from captivity would travel farther than Marco himself ever had. Into universities, courts, monasteries, and eventually into the age of exploration. The man captured on a battlefield became the man who opened the world with ink. Marco Polo's imprisonment did not diminish his legacy. Paradoxically, it ensured it. Genoa held him briefly. History would never release him. Imprisonment in Genoa, though born from war and defeat, became the moment Marco Polo's life transformed from lived experience into written legacy. Confined behind stone walls, far from the open skies and caravan paths of Asia, Marco found himself surrounded by silence, broken only by the clatter of chains, the murmurs of guards, and the restless thoughts of men who longed for freedom. Yet captivity offered something travel never could: time. Time to remember, time to recount, time to shape years of observation into narrative. In the dim light of his cell, Marco began to speak of palaces lit by lanterns like stars, of cities stitched together by canals broader than Venice itself, of mountains that scraped the heavens and deserts that swallowed sound. The journey he could no longer walk, he now retraced with memory. Sharing a cell with the romance writer Rustichello da Pisa proved pivotal. Rustichello, trained in the art of storytelling, listened as Marco described Kublai Khan's audience chamber, the power of the Mongol postal system, and the golden-roofed cities of the East. What Marco carried as fact, Rustichello shaped into structure, organizing, recording, polishing. Together, they created a record unlike anything Europe had ever read. The book, dictated through prison bars and written on scraps of parchment, did not read like a sailor's log or a merchant's ledger. It read like a window onto another world. It walked the reader through Asia with Marco as their guide, step by step, incense-scented hall by silk-filled hall. As the chapters grew, rumors seeped from cell to city. Visitors came not only to barter for ransom, but to hear tales of lands so vast they humbled European geography, of paper money backed by imperial decree, of emperors whose armies numbered like grains of sand. Some doubted him, others were spellbound, but none could look away. Marco's voice in captivity carried more wonder than most men's voices in freedom. His book became a bridge between civilizations, translating east to west long before diplomatic ties or printed maps could do so. The Mongol Empire, once distant myth, now unfolded across pages like a tapestry woven from deserts, rivers, dynasties, and trade. When Il Milione, known later as The Travels of Marco Polo, finally emerged from prison walls, it traveled faster than any caravan. Scholars and sailors copied it by hand, nobles read it aloud in courts, and skeptics argued whether one man could truly have seen so much. Yet belief or disbelief mattered little. The book lived. It sparked curiosity, challenged imagination, and expanded Europe's sense of possibility. Marco Polo entered prison as a merchant and came out a narrator of the world. The chains that held his body could not restrain his memory, and his words, written between walls of captivity, would one day guide explorers across oceans he never sailed. Through ink, Marco Polo continued to travel, century after century, long after the cell door closed behind him. When the travels of Marco Polo began circulating across Europe, it did more than entertain. It disrupted an entire worldview. Before Marco's account, Asia existed in European imagination as a realm of speculation shaped by myth, biblical geography, and scattered crusader reports. His descriptions replaced shadows with detail. Cities larger than any in Christendom, paper currency replacing gold, bureaucratic examinations selecting officials instead of noble birth, and road networks so extensive they carried messages from ocean to ocean. For the first time, Europe could picture the East not as a distant rumor, but as a structured, industrious, and wealthy civilization. Scholars debated whether his accounts could be true, yet even doubt carried influence. They were arguing about a world previously unimagined, The book spread through courts, monasteries, universities, and merchant halls. Maps began to shift. Cartographers sketched Cathay with firmer lines, placed Chipango, Japan, like a golden island beyond China, and stretched trade routes westward across steppes and deserts in ways no European had charted before. His descriptions of Mongol postal stations, salt revenue, and porcelain workshops introduced new economic concepts. Engineers marveled at bridges Marco claimed were long enough to take 1,000 paces, while physicians wondered about herbal medicines and refined medical practices he described. The book became a reference, a spark for inquiry rather than myth. It transformed Asia from legend into a destination. For explorers of later centuries, Marco Polo did not merely record history. He pointed forward. Columbus read his book with religious dedication, annotating the margins and believing that by sailing west, he might one day meet the grand empire Marco described. Mariners traced imagined coastlines from his pages. Kings invested in voyages based on the riches he claimed lay across the world. The travels became a blueprint for ambition. It gave Europeans something astonishing, a reason to believe the unknown was reachable. Exploration shifted from curiosity to strategy, from dream to plan. His words, written in a Genoese prison, helped set ships into open ocean. Though some dismissed his accounts as fanciful, the impact of disbelief was itself transformative. If Marco's story seemed unbelievable, then the world must be larger than the mind could grasp. And that realization alone fueled centuries of exploration. His book changed not land, but perception, and perception changes history. Europe entered the age of discovery not simply through compass and sail, but through imagination stretched by Marco's pages. Asia, once distant and shapeless, became a continent of cities, markets, emperors, and promise. Marco Polo did not bring Europe to the east. He brought the east to Europe, word by word, until no wall of ocean or myth could contain curiosity anymore. After regaining his freedom from Genoese captivity, Marco Polo settled back into Venice not as the wandering envoy of Kublai Khan, but as a man whose memory held more geography than most maps. He returned to a city transformed since his youth, its canals busier, its markets richer, its rivalries sharper. But to Marco, even Venice felt small compared to the continent he had crossed. Yet he adapted quickly, joining the Polo trading firm alongside his father and uncle. Their wealth, gathered through years of careful investment and the treasures they carried home from Asia, placed them among Venice's prosperous merchant families. They purchased properties, funded expeditions, traded in spices, silk, and gems, and built influence quietly. Marco, who once rode beneath imperial banners, now negotiated across tables rather than steps. Despite his fame as a traveler, Marco lived these years without embellishment or spectacle. He married Donata Badoer, daughter of an established Venetian family, and raised 3 daughters, Fantina, Belela, and Moretta. In their household, the East lived as an invisible guest. Silk garments hung beside Venetian wool. Stories of gilded temples and summer palaces whispered through the walls, and maps of Asia lay folded like sleeping secrets. Marco rarely spoke publicly about his journey, perhaps because he knew that most listeners heard marvels as exaggeration. The world he described was too vast for European imagination to fully hold, and he no longer sought to persuade skeptics. He had seen enough to understand that truth and belief were not always companions. Wealth did not erase the memories of his long travels, nor did it silence questions. Visitors, merchants, scholars, nobles came seeking details of Cathay, Cipango, and the Silk Road. Some asked for trade advice, others for stories. Marco answered selectively, offering what he wished and withholding what he felt the world was not yet ready to understand. His home became a place where East met West, not through caravans, but through conversation. Where Venetian wine was poured alongside tales of Mongol feasts, where curiosity moved more freely than goods. In these discussions, Marco continued to shape Europe's perception of Asia as quietly as he once shaped it from prison. As the years passed, Marco Polo remained a figure wrapped in equal parts respect and skepticism. Some Venetian nobles still wondered whether any man could have seen so wide a world. But Marco did not seek to prove himself. His life was already lived, his book already written. He walked Venice's bridges with the calm of a man who had crossed mountains no Venetian would ever see, sailed seas few had imagined. His later life was not marked by conquest or exploration, but by reflection. A final chapter in which he carried the Mongol Empire not in luggage, but in memory. In the quiet rhythm of trade and family, he lived out his days a merchant once more, yet forever changed by the roads he had walked and the world he had brought home. Marco Polo's life drew to a close in Venice in 1324. Far from the Mongol courts, where he had once debated policy with emperors and crossed kingdoms beyond European imagination. Age softened him, but never dimmed the memories of deserts, palaces, and caravan roads that shaped his youth. On his deathbed, surrounded by family, friends, and clerics, he was asked once more to admit that his stories were exaggerated, that the world he described was too vast, too rich, too strange to be real. His answer was simple, yet monumental. I have not told half of what I saw. It was not a boast, but a confession, an acknowledgement that the earth was larger than Europe believed, and that his book was merely a doorway, not a map. After his death, Marco Polo was buried in the Church of San Lorenzo. But his true burial was temporary. His legacy did not stay beneath stone. His account, The Travels of Marco Polo, continued to circulate, copied by hand, interpreted by scholars, and discussed by princes. While some doubted his words, many more were stirred by them. The world he revealed, of golden roofs and paper currency, of vast empires joined by trade routes like threads in a tapestry, haunted the imaginations of future generations. He did not see the age of exploration, but he helped ignite it. Long after his grave was sealed, the roads he described led other men toward the ocean. In the 15th and 16th centuries, explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, and Cabral studied Marco Polo's pages with reverence and hunger. Columbus carried a copy of Polo's book on his voyage across the Atlantic, scribbling notes in the margins, certain he was sailing towards the lands Marco described. Even centuries later, his writings shaped maps, strategies, and the dreams of those who sought to connect continents. Empires rose on the idea that the world was open, reachable, and filled with unknown wealth, a belief that Marco Polo helped plant in Europe like a seed that would change history's course. His legacy is more complex than pure discovery. Marco Polo did not conquer nations, but he conquered distance. He built bridges of knowledge rather than walls of steel. He showed Europe that difference was not danger, but wonder, that beyond familiar seas lay civilizations equal in sophistication, beauty, and innovation. His observations challenged Western self-assurance and widened the lens through which the world was seen. The Silk Road he traveled has faded into highways and borders, but the idea behind it, connection across cultures, remains alive. Marco Polo died a merchant. He became a messenger of worlds. His footsteps stretched from the canals of Venice to the gates of Xanadu, and his book stretched further still, into the minds of explorers who reshaped the planet. His legacy endures not in stone, but in curiosity itself. Wherever a traveler pushes past the horizon, they walk a road Marco Polo once opened, not with a ship or sword, but with the power of seeing, remembering, and telling the world what lies beyond.